For today's webinar, we have Brian Hoey, Director of the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Laboratory Division, presenting What Keeps You Awake at Night? Risk, Leading Change, and Challenging Decisions. Without further delay, here's Brian.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you all for joining me today with the webinar. My name is Brian Hoey. I've been with the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Laboratory for 29 years. I'll be 30 years in January. Started off as a DNA guy and now am the laboratory director. Recently, the colonel of the Missouri State Highway Patrol, my employer, asked me the question, what keeps you up at night? And without hesitation, I responded, the image of me sitting in front of a Senate panel answering the question, what did you know and when did you know it? And further thinking about my photo on the cover of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or Kansas City Star above the fold, looking like Nick Nolte's mugshot. And if you've never seen Nick Nolte's mugshot, I would challenge you to Google that. The fact is, you know, as I went on my journey from a DNA scientist, a DNA criminalist, to lab director, it became very apparent to me through that journey that our organizations are exposed to risk each and every day. And as we're going to find out through this webinar series, as organizational leaders, it's our job to balance the severity of consequences versus the frequency of occurrence, know our risk exposure, and be proactive to mitigate our risk. And really, that's quite enough to keep you up at night and by itself. But going back to the question that the colonel of the Missouri State Highway Patrol asked, what keeps you up at night? Until recently, the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Laboratory Division was a laboratory system comprised of 8 laboratories. Several incidents occurred at one of our laboratories in Macon, Missouri. Each incident in and of itself was small, but in combination with increased frequency, our exposure to critical or catastrophic risk was increasing. And that is the journey I want to take you on today. It all started with this. The drug chemist out there should be able to recognize this tick or chromatograph and mass spec as THC. If you are a drug chemist and you don't recognize this as THC, the drug chemists in my lab are probably cracking up right now. But anyway, please note the retention time of 9.361. This started off as a guard variety sample coming off a GCMS like most of our drug chemists see each and every day. What you see on the screen here was an attachment that was sent, in this case, to a reviewer. This is from a blank or a negative control. Our laboratory runs blanks between samples on a GCMS. As I understand it, this may or may not be a widely accepted practice in drug chemistry, and we could probably debate that point at some point in the chat, maybe. But anyway, that's our procedure and our protocol. Anyway, due to data retention issues, decentralization of our laboratory system, varying versions of instrument software, and other reasons, when a peak is discovered in a blank, our procedure requires a criminalist to click on the peak, to retrieve the mass spec, and quote unquote show their reviewer that the blank is clear. For our purposes here, this is the blank that came after the preceding sample that I just showed you. And again, note the retention time of 9.417. Looking at the tick or the chromatograph, one may intuitively think that this is THC in the blank. But for you drug chemists out there, again, the mass spec is not confirming that. When we zoom in on this scan of the blank I just showed you, we can see what happened. To produce a mass spec of the tick with a retention time of 9.417 in the negative control or blank, the criminalist performing the exam clicked just to the right of the peak, where I have indicated with the blue arrow there. And so the criminalist was not capturing the full peak and subsequently not capturing all of the ions that would be representative of THC. A less than astute technical reviewer may have missed it. And as it turns out, that truly was the intent of the examiner. So let's take a detour in our journey and focus our microscope out a bit, if you will. This is obviously a map of Missouri. And you can see that we have labs in all the garden spots in Missouri: Jefferson City, Howell County, Cape Girardeau. Our main lab is in Jefferson City. I don't know how many of you have ever been there. It's not really a vacation spot, if you will. The incident I just described happened in our Macon laboratory, which is just north there of Jefferson City. It's about 90 miles north. Our technical leader and all of our management are located in Jefferson City. So this wasn't necessarily an easy process to begin root cause on this case or this incident. This is a photo of our Macon laboratory. And despite what your first impression might be, it really does blend in with the neighborhood in Macon, Missouri. I think I've been in some Motel 6s that look better than this. By way of comparison, our Springfield laboratory, the newest in our fleet, is on the left. And again, the Macon laboratory is on the right. There are 30 people in the Springfield laboratory on the left, and it's about 30,000 square feet. 3 floors, 10,000 square feet per floor, roughly. And the building on the right, again, is our Macon laboratory. And there were 2 humans working in this lab. In the Macon laboratory, there was a supervisor and a drug chemist. And to unmask the story or peel the onion a little bit more, these 2 humans didn't get along at all. So we had this thing happen that I showed you at the beginning with the THC in this laboratory, the Macon lab. And without getting into the personnel issue too deeply, the employee was confronted about misrepresenting the data or the peak in the blank, and she lied. We had, the progressive discipline, if you will, or the progressive discussion where her technical reviewer confronted her and she lied, and the supervisor confronted her, she lied, the technical leader, the manager. We kind of escalated up, and we finally referred the issue to our professional standards division, with internal affairs, if you will, and an investigation ensued. It was important to us, to the laboratory, to have a third party look into this. We know our biases, either biases good or bad would creep in had we undertaken our own audit. It's very similar to when our laboratories have A&AB come in and do a professional assessment of us. We wanted a third party, although they work for our agency, but they are our internal investigations. We wanted this third party to come in and help us with this investigation. And they did a fantastic job. I was really amazed. These investigators, they're police officers, highway patrolmen. They by the time our technical leader and supervisors and managers sat down with these investigators, they could speak GCMS. I mean, they probably know a GCMS and data better than a DNA guy like me knows it. So they really did a great job. I can't be more complimentary of them. So anyway, we undertook this investigation. Suffice it to say, the employee continued to lie and misrepresent the data, and was eventually terminated. So part of the risk here not only is the individual and what was the eventual outcome, but this left one supervisor in the Macon laboratory. And so now what do you do with that person working on their own or that lab? I mean, as you can see in the photo, it's not necessarily one of the nicest of all buildings or structures. So what do we do with that lab? And that became part of the risk assessment that we had to undertake for the sake of this webinar. Okay, so this webinar is all about risk, and the series is all about risk. So the story I just told you was one of risk. We had two drug chemists working in a laboratory together who did not get along. Two-person shops in and of themselves are risky. Employee conflict is risky. Decentralization is risky. And just the overall condition of the lab, as you saw in the photo, risky. So let's zoom out again and take another little detour and talk a little bit about leadership and risk, right? As leaders, as organizational leaders, and us having to address risk, let's first take a look at the levels of leadership. So there's 3 levels of leadership, and it helps to know where you're at in these levels of leadership and how to lead at that level, how to be led and follow, and as importantly, know how others are leading you. So the first one on the left there in red is tactical leadership. In our parlance, this is usually a first-line supervisor. And as a first-line supervisor, your exposure to risk is usually firsthand. You see it in the form of technical reviews, performance appraisals, knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, motivation, satisfaction, and performance, MSPs. And performance equals motivation times ability. So if somebody, has the ability to do their job, the A, but has low performance, we can usually chalk that up to somebody's unmotivated. There's a motivation issue somewhere. These are all the things that first-line supervisors usually see. And so somebody is making errors, or there's technical errors in their reports or their data or their notes. We're going to deal, as a frontline supervisor, we're going to deal with that person generally. And we deal with it, through their performance appraisals, or we retrain them or things like that. As a first-line supervisor, a tactical leader, we often don't see if something might be systemic. So we see, things like protocol drift, where someone may figure out a shortcut or do a thing, and the others find that thing attractive and they start doing that thing, but that thing is rarely caught at the frontline supervisor level. In our case, in the Macon laboratory, our supervisor was too close to the flame. As I already mentioned, these two humans did not get along, and the supervisor was too close to the flame to truly be objective. And I don't want to throw that supervisor in the bus, because that person's outcome is a pivotal part of our journey here, and I'll unveil what happened with that person a bit later. So the second level, the one in green, is a strategic leader. And that's someone who is like perhaps a manager in our parlance, or maybe that's supervises many other supervisors, oversees larger groups of people, or this could be somebody like a technical leader. In our instance, in the Missouri State Highway Patrol, our technical leader, our drug chemistry technical leader, oversees the technical operations for 31 drug chemists. So they are truly strategic in that form of leadership. And at that level, this is where somebody might likely be able to tell if the risk posed is systemic or not. In our situation with the Macon Lab, our technical leader quickly moved to planning and programming and developed a sampling plan to review cases of all 31 of our drug chemists. We needed to see if this miscalling of the blank or this misrepresentation was pervasive and systemic. And then lastly, on the right in the purple there is executive leadership. And that's kind of my role in the Missouri State Highway Patrol, lab director, somebody who has the capacity to buffer the environment, think about the laboratory as a whole, the political, budgetary, economic impacts of the risk. So immediately when this happened, when our technical leader and our supervisors really started working on this problem at a strategic and tactical level, I pivoted to saying, okay, what is going to be the political fallout of this? Is this going to affect our budgets? How am I going to spend this when the newspaper finds out about it? And those types of things. So we have to buffer the environment, smooth the environment, adapt. I immediately began thinking, What is everyone else in the lab going to think about this situation? How is everybody else going to react? And what is my response going to be? So what do we do as either a tactical leader or a strategic leader or an executive leader? What do we do when faced with this type of identified risk or even uncertainty now? Because in our instance, we have one person working in this laboratory that is in pretty bad shape. Well, we have attribution error, of course. So in general, when faced with complex questions, any question, not just the one at hand that we face in the lab, we often rely on what psychologists call heuristics to simplify operations. Heuristics produce fast, intuitive thinking and are often useful. For example, when you're walking down a path or a trail or something, and the tall grass starts blowing or shaking next to you, we can think that maybe it's just the wind, or our heuristic would say, hey, that's an animal, let's move on. So our heuristics can really help us, this intuitive, quick thinking or stereotyping. But it may also prompt us to draw conclusions that might not be accurate. For example, if you're walking down a dark alley and you see a shadowy figure, we may draw a conclusion that might not be very accurate, but may still keep us safe. However, as the second example may allude to, sometimes heuristics lead us to inaccurate biases. When it comes to risk, the availability heuristic in particular ignores what are statistically referred to as base rates or frequencies of occurrence. Recent incidents are given more weight than known frequencies or base rates because they come more easily to mind. So using the example that's on the screen, and you've been seeing the screen as I've been babbling on, you're going, what the heck is going on? But using the example on the screen, the base rate for shark attacks is approximately 1 in 11.5 million. But if we hear of a recent shark attack, it will likely weigh heavily on our mind if we're vacationing at the beach. Every time I'm at the beach, I hear the Jaws movie theme in the back of my head, which is why if I'm at the beach, you usually find me sitting at a tiki bar, admiring the beach from afar, or the ocean from afar, if you will. The availability heuristic is all about frequency. It's risk assessment. Risk assessment is about the frequency of occurrence versus the relevance that something's going to happen. Say, for example, heart disease is responsible for 600,000 deaths per year. That's nearly 1 in every 4 deaths. But because we hear about homicide, suicide, COVID deaths, terrorist attack, plane crashes on the news, we tend to discount heart disease as a viable option at all for death. So getting back to our story, I know I got off track there a little bit. I tend to do that. I apologize. Getting back to our story, once we began looking at the problem in our Macon lab, our drug chemistry TL used a hypergeometric sampling method. I have no idea what that is, but I think it's pretty cool to say hypergeometric sampling method. Apparently, this is similar how we do uncertainty of measurement. We arrived at a number of statistically sampled cases that we felt we needed to look at from each of our 31 drug chemists to satisfy whether we had a systemic problem here. So we're going to look at a statistical sampling of all of our 31 drug chemists, and we're going to see if this blank issue is happening and if there's protocol drift, or if this is the thing that the person thought was attractive and shared it with other people who thought it was attractive, and so on. So the first problem we ran into was, you probably guessed it, us. Because as soon as we began to see minor issues or minor anomalies in these data, we immediately attributed to the same problem as what was happening in Macon. We succumbed to the availability heuristic. It was the most recent thing in our mind, so that's what we attribute everything to. And as the consummate professionals that we are, we did what everybody would do in this case. We freaked out. That's what we did. So if lesson 1 is know the level you're leading at, lesson 2 is avoid the availability heuristic. Think more slowly and rationally when these problems are presented to you. Use frequencies of occurrence, use base rates, or maybe expand your sample size. So what do we do when we freak out? Well, we continue to freak out. So This slide that you see on the screen here, this is actually from Mark Goldstein's book, Just Listen. And I believe, I can't remember what chapter it is, but if you know the book or you can get access to the book, I highly recommend it. And he has a chapter that's quite literally called Move Yourself from O blank to OK. So we freaked out. And I think that's a natural occurrence, right? The availability heuristic, you have recent events. So you react poorly, and that's the reaction phase. Stuff happens. You can't let these situations or, rumors, gossip, whatever, derail you. We have triggers that get us stressed and make us emotional, but we all can't react poorly when these things happen. We have to regroup very quickly and move forward. We can't make ourselves victims and others villains. It's too easy to vilify people and cast attributions and blame. So the sooner we can get ourselves under control and begin looking at the right problem, we can start the process of solving the problem. And Goldstein outlines this in a very deliberative process in his book. The reaction phase, you're like, oh my gosh, this is a disaster. I'm screwed. We're going to get fired. Going to close the lab. How am I going to look on the front page of the newspaper? Then the release phase is, oh God, this huge mess. I'm going to get stuck with cleaning it up. Oh God, my work life is going to stink for a while. The recenter phase, all right, I can fix this, but it's just not going to be fun. I'm not going to want to come to work in the near future. And then the refocus phase, I'm not going to let this ruin me or my career or my laboratory. And so I got to figure out what to do. And then the re-engage phase, I'm ready to fix this. So lesson 3, after you go through freak out mode, lesson 3 is move yourself from old dirty word to okay as soon as possible, and we can refocus. And the sooner we can refocus and get ourselves under control, we can begin solving the problem. And so that's where I started. So another quick detour, and I know our journey keeps taking these little turns, but if you've never heard of this psychology experiment called mindless eating, I would suggest looking at this too. I read about this in a book called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, and it describes a study conducted by Brian Winsink from Cornell University. And he himself wrote a book called Mindless Eating. And in this, it's basically just a thumbnail sketch of this. In this study, researchers gave free popcorn to unwitting moviegoers. However, the popcorn was wretched. It was in fact popped 5 days earlier and was so stale that it squeaked when you ate it. Some moviegoers described the taste and squeak as if it were like styrofoam, like little styrofoam peanuts. Some moviegoers got the stale popcorn in medium-sized buckets, or what we would normally eat at the movie theater, and others got popcorn in a bucket that was so big that it was determined that no human could ever sit down and eat this much popcorn, stale or not, in a single sitting. The results were stunning. People with the larger buckets ate 53% more popcorn than the people with the smaller buckets. Remember, the popcorn was stale. So armed with these data, one may conclude that humans are just gluttons and need to adopt healthier snacking habits, or perhaps we need to go as far as create more public policy and shrink the size of the buckets, somewhat like what New York City did several years ago with the shrinking of the soda bottles to try and control people's health. So what we see here is an interesting problem on risk mitigation and change. This can be an easy change problem with simply shrinking the bucket or convincing people to think differently by, altering their lifestyle. But basically how we can look at this is simplify it even further and say, is this mindless eating problem, is this popcorn problem, is this a people problem? Are people just gluttons? Or is this a situation problem? Are we giving people just too much to eat? So after the incident in our Macon laboratory happened, And, we looked at it, we began sampling our other chemists, we freaked out, we went from, oh, dirty word. And as I began moving myself from dirty word to okay, I began to compartmentalize this in my head. Do we have a people problem? Is this a isolated people or person problem, or is this a situation problem? Is this, is it a problem with the laboratory? Is it a problem with the system? Is it a problem with the protocol, procedure, policy? So I felt we needed to compartmentalize those and attack them in two separate parallel management styles. So those of us who are organizational leaders probably have never been to a leadership class or seminar in which we had not talked about Kotter and his 8 steps of change. Really what this boils down to is, and I looked at this as a people problem or a situation problem, but it's a change problem. Something had to change, right? We're going to change out the personnel, might have to change the supervisor, might have to change the laboratory, have to change the procedure, have to change the protocol. It's a change problem. And anytime we are faced with risk, once we identify the risk and we do root cause analysis, it change is coming. So I then kind of turned to my leadership materials and I looked at Kotter and I said, okay, what do we have to do? So we had to terminate somebody. We had to deal with the remaining employee. We had to figure out what to do with the lab, either close it or review our process. We had to look at our process. In the meantime, we're snooping around other criminal cases, interviewing them, how they process a negative control. They're scratching their heads because they really don't know what's going on. We can't really talk about the investigation of the employee. Everyone really knows what's happening, and so there was a lot of uncertainty, and we were creating much of it ourselves. And with us as focal leaders and managing these things, there's fear and uncertainty spreading throughout our lab system. And uncertainty portends more risk, right? So as this started to go on and we started to get rumors building up and conjecture and subjectivity, it really created a lot of uncertainty. And as former Defense Secretary James Mattis put it, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. So, we really had a sense of urgency here. So we'll talk about a few key things that we did following Kotter. Number one is increase that sense of urgency. So the first step we took was to increase the sense of urgency. Obviously, we had to make decisions quickly about the affected lab and terminated employee, and now we have a single person working alone, et cetera. What makes establishing urgency so important is the forces of complacency are so powerful. Complacency is our psychological safe zone. I actually threw this slide together, and I actually said this at ASCLD. I threw this particular slide that you're seeing on the screen together for Ray Wickenheiser because of his business acumen. So if you know Ray, you can send him a quick message and tell him that I talked about him in the webinar. I looked at this as complacency and urgency as like a supply and demand curve, specifically thinking of having Ray in mind. When we have a surplus of complacency, we have a scarcity of urgency, and vice versa. I don't know if there's an equilibrium or nexus like there is with supply and demand. But I would posit there likely is. And, as I challenged Ray, I thought maybe this could be his next paper. So as I mentioned, the sources of complacency are all over us, and they're pretty robust, and they do crowd out urgency. So for us, the main sources of complacency were, in our particular situation with Macon, our main sources of complacency were the absence of major and visible crisis. We knew the 2 employees in that lab didn't get along. I mean, we were going up there and managing or mismanaging the problem. We knew there was a problem, but we just kept managing it and not completely fixing it, and really kind of hoping it would go away. There was a lot of happy talk from senior management. We would go up there and we would sit the employees down. They would, talk, and we'd talk, and, hey, stop that. Don't make me stop this car. And we'd turn around, drive back to Jefferson City and think, oh, that conversation went good. I think we finally got it this time. Too much happy talk. There wasn't a real major crisis. And the human nature and its capacity for denial, especially when people are busy or stressed. I had posited the idea of downsizing that lab many times and getting rid of the 2-person shops. In fact, when I interviewed for lab director, I had posed this idea, and I discussed the risks a lot in not only my job interview, but pursuant to that with my leadership apparatus. But by and large, we were complacent, and we fell victim to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think a lot of us face these things in our laboratories, in our lives. You need to make a change, and there's something that's itching you in the back of your head. But we do face a lot of complacency. It's in our human nature to say, if it's not broke, don't fix it. It's good. We're going to move on. Cotter cautions that change requires more than just leadership. It requires good management to implement vision, acquire people to assemble a coalition, et cetera. When leading the environment, leaders and managers need to know what that feedback is telling them, and when not to just monitor the environment, potentially need for change, and begin active planning. So when we move from the lower right quadrant of this diagram to the upper left, we need to have more of a sense of urgency. When we were just managing the problems in our Macon laboratory, we were just monitoring function or dysfunction, as it were. We felt there was little certainty of a problem, little degree of relevance, as this chart would demonstrate. But after the problem happened, we had to move to planning and programming very quickly. I would posit that with most things we do, particularly as executive leaders, we have to be moving around this grid quite a bit as we marshal through our priorities, and ask ourselves with every priority, am I monitoring function? Am I contingency planning? Am I in planning and programming phase? And I would also posit that it's probably a good idea for us to start teaching our frontline supervisors to be doing these things with their priorities as well, because I can tell you, as we've talked about thus far with this problem, jumping from monitoring to planning very, very quickly, you move fast and you break things. And what you don't want to break are the humans in your laboratory and the people who you are truly caring for. You're truly in charge and caring for those people there and their emotions. And when we create fear and uncertainty, we create a lot of stress, and we potentially create more situations for risk. So jumping from monitoring right to planning without planning and programming, without the contingency spanning or the boundary spanning piece, that's not a really good way to go. That is perhaps too much urgency. So on this slide, you see Steve Jobs, Legos, Martin Luther King. Steve Jobs convinced everyone they needed an iPod. In fact, Creative Labs had a much better product at the time, but they were very techno-babbly in their messaging, and said, here's 5 gigabytes of space, and you can put this, that, and the other music and things on it. Steve Jobs said, holding up the iPod as he's doing in that picture there, he said, 5,000 songs in your pocket. And everyone goes, oh, I got it now. Steve Jobs told us the why. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, not a plan. I have a dream. Each of these leaders had vision, and they told us the why. So steps 3 and 4 of Cotter are get the right vision and communicate buy-in. This is essentially Simon Sinek's Start With Why. And if you haven't read that book, I would highly recommend that as well. Communicate the why to your folks. This was a bit challenging due to the termination piece, but we nevertheless communicated what we could, when we could. And we tried to be open and honest as all steps of the process. we were talking and we were also listening to feedback, or so we thought, how communication goes. We didn't get it right initially. We got it better as time wore on, but we didn't get it right initially. But when you have situations in your lab where you have risk and you have to deal with that risk and you have a problem, you have to deal with that problem, you have to marshal in change, you have fear and uncertainty, it's going to happen. But start with why and explain that why to your people. Why are we going through this? Why are we changing our procedures? Why are we changing our protocols? Why are we closing a laboratory? Why are we terminating somebody? Explain the why as much as you can. That will garner buy-in. Getting the right vision will get the buy-in. And as I said, we're actually, we're about 18 months out of this, and we're still building the why. We're still trying to rebuild the communication, the feedback process. It takes a while, but just like risk management, it's continuous improvement, and that's currently where we're at. So here's the new map of our lab system. You'll notice that Macon is no longer designated with a star, which is what we designate our laboratories as. We closed the lab last June. Compartmentalizing this question into people problem versus situation problem pursuant to freaking out and moving ourselves from oh darn to okay, I was able to approach the problem from a couple directions. Approaching it as a people problem, I had a crucial conversation with the remaining criminalist, the criminalist supervisor in that laboratory. And I posed the question whether they would be able to get along with another criminalist if we were to hire somebody and replace the criminalist in the laboratory. I asked whether if we hired a new person, would we be headed down the same path of the employee conflict that began or was a critical point in this problem. And the criminalist supervisor, once we had established mutual respect, mutual purpose, she looked me in the eye and said, I don't think so. She had a lot of demons in that laboratory. She had a lot of conflict in that laboratory. And she really, truly thought, had we hired another person, she had to supervise that person, she would always be thinking the other she was going to drop. So we offered her a number of ways out. We had, obviously 6 other laboratories that she'd go to, or 7 other laboratories, I guess she could go to. So she made the decision. She traveled around to some of the labs. She met with a lot of other of her coworkers. She looked at the areas, and she reflectively requested a transfer to our Springfield laboratory, and that was the laboratory I showed you earlier in the webinar. And I'm happy to report she's flourishing. She's doing a fantastic job, and we really appreciate her willingness to move and do that. Once that move happened, things moved very quickly, and we were able to shut down the Macon laboratory, which helped us. Again, it was another sense of urgency. It helped us start the healing process after this event. By moving quickly from the dirty word to okay, we were able to clear our own vision and establish a new one for the laboratory. We did not seek villains in the lab. We moved ourselves away from that availability heuristic and saw anomalies for what they were: stochastic anomalies and errors, not systemic problems. More importantly, through the interviews with our employees, we discovered that our process, situation problem, not people, were contributing to the anomalies and errors. And although we wouldn't expect the same problem to occur again, we took proactive steps to add QC measures, new ways of reviewing data, et cetera. And we're continuing to improve. We're looking into networking instruments together, getting a central repository for data, and these types of things to help marshal in more QC measures to mitigate any further risk. So obviously all that gave us the window we needed to begin looking at options to close the laboratory, another situation problem, as it were, and we were able to do that. We had our sense of urgency. We began the process of planning and programming, as well as communicating buy-in and the why with our followers in the lab. So ultimately, we all want to try and avoid this. This is not an indictment on any of the leaders or the people involved with this particular issue, and God bless them. However, this truly is what keeps me up at night. As leaders, we need to address issues when we see them. We must not be complacent. And when issues arise, we need to move from monitoring to planning and programming, as we showed in that chart a moment ago. So, and to that end, you can read the slide on the screen. Traditionally, we used supervisors' meetings, email blasts, et cetera, to get communication disseminated, not unlike I'm sure many of you out there do. However, like I think we all do, we were discovering gaps in our communication, most importantly in feedback, and this situation taught us a lot. So recently, our laboratory began expanding our communication modes and efforts and started monthly meet with the management sections where all employees can ask questions of management directly through a WebEx meeting. And we can have that direct feedback that supersedes the 3 levels of leadership that I introduced earlier. This is not to subvert our traditional meetings with supervisors, et cetera. But, we know that when we have the telephone game, sometimes things are not delivered or communicated as accurately as we would intend. So we started these Meet the Manager meetings over WebEx, and so far I think they've been very successful. In one of our first meetings, this question was posed. So that's why I put this quote right after the Netflix slide. And really, it says, can you assure that we are not going to be the next Netflix special? So in finishing up here, establishing expectations is a key ingredient to leadership and risk management. And it's important that we inform our followers of our focus on continuous improvement, mitigation of risk, our commitment to accountability, and our commitment to feedback. However, we need to share the why we are doing that. And that's capital WHY. We are doing that. Start with the why. And so I reiterated the why and also stated to our followers when this question was posed, I stated that it's everybody's job to continuously improve and help assure that we are not going to be the next Netflix special. People won't buy the process of continuous improvement or feedback unless they know the why and why you're doing it. And if they're aware of the why, your feedback becomes proof of what you believe. And this further underscores why we initiate these Meet the Management meetings, so we can increase our bandwidth for feedback, and we can further increase our bandwidth for the why. So to reiterate Cotter again, steps 4 and 5, communicate, buy-in, empower action. And then Cotter's, to reflect back on Cotter's steps 7 and 8 are don't let up and make it stick. Which basically means create a culture around the new change. And with regard to managing risks, leading change, and challenging decisions, which was the title of this webinar that face us, we have to create that culture of feedback, which requires feedback in all directions. We have to teach our followers how to hold themselves, their coworkers, others, and us as their leaders accountable. We have to encourage our team members to support one another by providing feedback when they observe these misses and not turn each other into victims and villains. Rather, we need to turn the situation into a story, like the story and the journey I took you on today. Stories provide meaning. They evoke emotion and they empower action. So we need to teach our followers to not vilify their coworkers, point fingers, have fear, have uncertainty, but turn the situation into a story and evoke that emotion, empower action to change the outcome of the story. And with that, I hope my story today resonated with you, evokes some emotion, and will empower action in you. So I want to thank you and thank RTI and the folks for asking me to be a part of this series. I hope you got something out of my little story today. And I guess we turn it over to the Q&A. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you, Brian, for sharing that story with us. I think you gave us some really great takeaways. For today's Q&A session, we have guest moderator John Grassel from RTI International joining us. Please take it away, John and Brian.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. Absolutely entertaining as we knew it would be, and fascinating subject. You did have me there at the large bucket of popcorn, though. I am a prime suspect of always obtaining the large bucket for some reason.
I think I am too, as well. It's the large bucket of popcorn, the large mug of beer. It's I really do need somebody to shrink those down for me. Right.
So we have a number of questions from the audience, and if there are still questions out there to be asked, please put them into the chat, and we will certainly give them to Brian. So Brian, for our first question, knowing that the two individuals had an antagonistic relationship, what barriers were in place to keep the situation as the status quo rather than dealing with it head on prior to a negative situation festering?
As I mentioned in the webinar, I think the barriers were us. The laboratory is 90 miles away, and the supervisor up there that I discussed, I talked about in the webinar. She was doing an amazing job just trying to keep things under control, and she was feeding back to us and telling us that there were these problems, and that the person she was supervising was antagonistic. And we just kept saying, hey, you're doing a great job. Keep doing what you're doing, And we, like I said, we'd go up there, we'd sit down and we'd talk with them. And we had that complacency. We were looking for happy talk. We just wanted the thing to fix itself. And, for everyone out there and for the barrier in the question, don't let yourself be the barrier. I think as the leader of the laboratory, it was my fault. I did not take the situation seriously enough, and the supervisor up there, she was feeding back to us. She was telling us what was going on, and we were not supporting her, and that is shame on us. This situation taught us a lot, and we really almost broke a very, very good person and a very, very good supervisor, and I still feel horribly about that.
Well, thank you, Brian. Next question is, now that you are on the other side of the journey that you described, how are things in the lab now?
As I mentioned in the last couple of slides there, it's been 18 months or so, and we're still struggling. Like I said, there's only so much we can really disclose internally about this, and I know we're trying to thread a needle because I'm telling the entire country about what happened here, but not really disclosing a lot internally. So I'm really trying to thread the needle. So there is still some uncertainty in the laboratory, and there's a lot of conjecture about, this is the best kept secret and what have you. We're still kind of moving forward. As we implemented new QC measures in drug chemistry, our backlog and turnaround times did go up, and we're having to deal with that. And obviously, because we had to change policy in some of the way we do QC and QA, there are some frustrations, and we respect that. And like I said, we try to give the why and give as much of the why as we can and garner that buy-in and vision. But, it takes time, and we're still working through a lot of it.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Also, I know that you mentioned several different good resources for the audience. And one of the questions was, can you restate the title of the book that you mentioned about communicating buy-in?
I believe that one was Simon Sinek's Start With Why. I do a lot of leadership talks, and I teach in some leadership academies and things like that, and I use that book like crazy. That's really one of my go-tos.
Great. And are you utilizing a laboratory information management system across all of your laboratories, one that can be assessed by management and leadership in each of the locations that you have?
Yes, we are. It's currently we have a homegrown, a home-built laboratory information management system, and we're in the process of transitioning that to a new commercial off-the-shelf product. So that's going to be our next big lift. But yeah, we have a laboratory information management system, but due to some of the complexities that I discussed earlier in the webinar, decentralization, instruments having different versions, instruments not being networked. Until about 3 years ago, drug chemistry was really doing a lot of paper case records. So when we had to do our root cause analysis on this, it was having to go back to archives and pull out a lot of paper, which again made this thing drag on a little bit longer and made it a little more challenging.
Great. So our next question, are you finding the need to share the why behind big quality decisions increasing in importance is due to generational shifts in the staff, or has that always been your approach?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'd like to think it's always been an approach I've like to have taken, or I've tried to take. I've been in leadership for, formally for about 18 years. And it's an approach that I learned early on. But that said, I think, the generational piece is generations have changed. And I do believe our younger workers need that why much more than I did 30 years ago when I started.
Brian, in line with that, has you or your management group changed anything in your leadership style while going through this journey? And I know that you mentioned the 3 levels of leadership: tactical, strategic, executive. If you could also kind of tell us, how is there a set amount of time moving between these that you have seen based on your experience over the years?
So the first piece of that is, yes, we're trying to change our leadership and management style. Like I said, we tried to create these meet the management meetings. We're trying to open up more bandwidth on our feedback of our followers. When we have situations happen in the laboratory, not like this particular situation, but other things that have happened recently, we try and create. We have these kind of summit meetings that we have with our leaders and with our folks to try and drill into these things and have a much more hands-on approach with our management, administrative, executive type personnel. And as far as the time in between, in our laboratory, you can become a first-line supervisor or a tactical leader in roughly 6 years or so, 6-7 years. And I think my observation personally has been it's a very difficult transition for a scientist who, has had biology, chemistry, whatever in college, and 7 years worth of experience in the laboratory to then pivot very quickly to leading people. And I've seen that to be a very, very big challenge within our laboratory. I know I struggled with it myself, and it's been a mantra and a mission of mine to try and coach young people into these leadership positions, because really the situation I described today It's not a matter of if it's going to happen to you, it's a matter of when. And you've got to be prepared to handle these types of things. And I don't know if many people are. In fact, I wasn't, obviously. I made a lot of mistakes during this.
And Brian, one more question from the audience. Although the why explains rationale, change does not always equal improvement or efficiency in the eyes of many. How do you ensure the make it stick step?
Well, and I think that's where we rely a lot on Deming's continuous improvement and kind of the process that we go through with our A&AB assessments. The why does explain the rationale, and you got to monitor the situation and try to figure out, okay, did what we put in place change the situation or fix what's going on? And if it didn't, then you require that feedback to come back. You listen to the followers, listen to the people involved, and change direction. I think one of the biggest things we can do is think again. As scientists, right? We hypothesize. We do a test or create an experiment, and we come up with a result or conclusion. And if our hypothesis is wrong, we think again, and we re-hypothesize and we adjust. And that's what we have to do. Try and explain the why, go through your process, and if it doesn't work, go back to the beginning and try again.
Thank you, Brian. I think we have time for one more quick question, and which is, have you or would you consider establishing a leadership or professional development training program for all of your staff?
We do have one internally at the Highway Patrol. It's called Police Leadership, the West Point Model, and I encourage all of my staff to go through it. In fact, we've had about 30 or 40% of our staff go through. I am always looking for opportunities to teach leadership classes. So, I would be all in favor of having something like that. But here at my own shop, we already have a pretty good leadership class that I would highly recommend for anybody.
Thank you so much, Brian, for your time today. And unfortunately, we do not have time for all of the remaining questions, but please feel free to contact us, reach out for additional information. Contact information will reappear in the final slides. And thank you so much.
Thanks, John.
Before you leave today's webinar, please participate in our short 5-minute survey. Simply click the checkbox icon directly above the chat to access the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback is critical information that helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. We would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. There is also a link to the FTCOE website, the Just Science podcast, and the FTCOE newsletter registration. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.